So good afternoon from this part of the world, and good morning to those living in the future. Here is Thursday, and it's already Friday in New Zealand. Welcome to this event that we titled Climate Action Teams, a model for climate cooperation, progress in the development of a potential creating baseline in Chile. My name is Francisco Pinto. I'm an economist, and I'm also part of the supporting team of this initiative that is also supported by the Environmental Defense Fund, MOTU, the Center for Climate Change of the Pontificia Catholic University of Chile, and Perspective Group. For your knowledge, this session will be recorded. So let's start. I will introduce our first presenter, Mrs. Suzi Kerr. Suzi is the Chief Economist at Environmental Defense Fund. She was until May 2019 a senior fellow, and from 1998 to 2009, founding director at MOTU Research in New Zealand. She graduated from Harvard University in 1995 with a PhD in economics. Her current research work focuses on climate change. She empirically and theoretically investigates domestic and international climate change policy with a special emphasis on emission pricing and land use in both the tropics and New Zealand. She has led and co-led several large international projects, including the writing of the World Bank and ICAP Handbook on Emission Trading in Practice. Suzi is also the person who leads the initiatives that brings us together today. So please, Suzi, the screen is yours. You can share your screen.
Thank you, Francisco. Wait a second. Should all be seeing my screen now. Kia ora tato, buenos dias.
All right.
Welcome to everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I'd particularly like to thank EDF's wonderful partners in this effort, including Francisco Pinto, José, Miguel, Valdés, and Francisco Meza from Pontificia Catholic University in Chile, and also Ana Puello at MOTU in New Zealand, and also our friends and invited panelists, Sarah Deblock, Paul Young, Paolo Palotti, and Juan Pedro Sal. So as we all know, as we all know, the world needs to transition to net zero, and we need to do it fast. And every year that we are delaying, it becomes more of a challenge, and we need to go even faster. The other thing that is less focused on, but that I think everyone in this room knows, is that most of the mitigation going forward is going to happen in emerging and developing countries. By 2030, 70% of emissions will be in the developing world, and that's where the mitigation still needs to happen. Efficient trade between countries, of cooperation across countries, could really allow us to accelerate ambition. So we could double global mitigation with no extra cost, and this comes from a couple of studies, one within EDF by Perez Cabezas et al. And another by IATA. And from that modeling, we can see that if we were to efficiently allocate resources across the world in order to mitigate more rapidly, then we would end up transferring 2 to 4 billion tons of emissions credits every year from now until 2035. And for contrast, in the Clean Development Mechanism, which has been operating since 2001, in total, cumulatively, 4 billion units were created. So we need to massively increase the scale of what we're doing at the same time as we increase the integrity of those trades to make sure that the resources that are transferred are really leading to transformational change. So what we're doing in this initiative is trying to develop a really high credibility model with a very different approach from that of creating a credit and selling it on a general liquid market. And the approach focuses on bringing together the host country And in this case, we are exploring this in a concrete way with Chile, with specific partner countries who would work with the host country as a team in order to accelerate the mitigation of Chile, while also New Zealand and Switzerland will learn from Chile, which we have already started to do and to see very much. So this is the approach that we're taking, and we're in the process of designing that mechanism and working out how it could really work in a concrete way, because we would like to work out how to scale that up to achieve those $2 to $4 billion of credit transfer, sorry, 2 to 4 billion credits that need to be traded each year if we're going to be truly efficient. So the way that a climate team works is that rather than focusing on credits that are developed at a project scale or relying on links between emissions trading systems, what we're looking at is the host country as a whole and looking at transformation of the entire emissions inventory. So the first step is to think about what the business as usual pathway of emissions looks like at that national level. So that's the BAU. And then countries, including Chile, have made commitments already under the Paris Agreement. They've frequently made a commitment to what their emissions will be in 2030. Chile has actually also made a commitment to a budget for emissions over a longer period of time. And what you would do in what we are doing within a climate action team is that we are taking the existing level of commitment of Chile and turning that into a crediting baseline that is expressed in an annual sense. So that's something that needs to be done together. And because this is done at a national scale, and because Chile, as just one example, is taking really quite ambitious reductions, they're promising quite ambitious reductions under their existing commitment, we can be confident that if emissions go even lower than that purple line, then they are truly additional. Any reductions are going to be truly additional to Chile's existing efforts. So then, in order to work out how many credits would be available to transfer, or ITMOs, if you like the UN jargon, then we use the national inventory. The advantage of using the national inventory is that it's relatively credible. It's used standard rules. It's something that's been developed over time in a consistent way. It's something that continuously improves. And there are low transactions costs. It's something that Chile is doing anyway for its internal planning and for its international reporting. And the difference between that green line of what is actually observed in terms of emissions and the purple line is the number of credits that would be available to potentially transfer to the partners. And Chile may decide to keep some of those themselves. But when you're looking at this model, we need to have some better idea of what those lines actually mean in real numbers. So Chile as the host country who would be doing the real action on the ground, and Switzerland and New Zealand as partners, and the wider world want to know whether that crediting baseline is really going to generate additional reductions, or is the business as usual pathway that Chile is claiming actually inflated in some way. So that's one thing that we want to know. The second thing that Chile and the partners want to know is how big is the gap between that purple line and what the green line could be? How much could an agreement like this really reduce emissions faster? How far can Chile actually go beyond the commitments it's already made if they have extra resources? Because setting up an agreement like this and putting all the effort into accelerating mitigation is challenging and it's costly and it requires effort. So we need to have some confidence that there's really a gain there, a gain for Chile in terms of help to move along its decarbonisation pathway, and because they would get some payments as they show that they are reducing their emissions, and they would get some help from the other countries, and gains for the partner countries because they would actually receive credits that they can use to support more ambitious goals of their own and show Paris compliance with those goals. So just in summary, the climate team action goals overall are to provide resources and rewards for host country governments who support transformational change. So transformational change in terms of enabling policies that allow change to happen, and policies that incentivize mitigation. We want to create a more attractive environment for ambitious clean investment, both for the companies who are acting locally so they feel more confident in making investments that depend on Chile really taking seriously transformation, and for international investors who might be looking to invest in Chile, but to make investments that only make sense if there are additional incentives beyond and policies beyond the current policy set. We aim to help coordinate actions so that when people are trying to work with Chile and Chileans are trying to work to increase mitigation in a particular sector, those actions are part of a wider transformational plan. And that's something that the modeling can really inform, because it can show the sorts of actions that will need to be happening and where the interrelationships are across sectors or across companies within sectors. We want to act jointly and together to pool our skills across countries, as none of us really know how to mitigate climate change effectively. This is a new journey for all of us, and to share risk when countries are taking ambitious actions. And ultimately, we're trying to reduce global emissions faster and in a more equitable way. So I'll pass back to Francisco.
Thank you very much, Suzi, for these introductions. So I would like to mention that we have a chat box available. If you have any questions, please go ahead and we can try to deal with that during our panel discussion. So now I would like to introduce our next presenter, Francisco Javier Meza. Francisco is professor of the Faculty of Agriculture and Forestry at the Pontificia Catholic University of Chile. He is member of the Center for Global Change, an interdisciplinary research center within the Catholic University. And he is co-director of AquaSec, Water Security Center of Excellence of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change. He is coordinator of the Science Advisory Council on Agricultural Sustainability for the Ministry of Science. He's lead author of the IPCC Special Report on Land and IPCC AR6. He has supervised more than 20 graduate students within the program of Agricultural Sciences. He's also a member of the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences of Chile. His areas of research are climate risk management, vulnerability, impact, and adaptation of climate variability and change of water resources and agricultural systems. He holds a Master of Science in Engineering from Pontificia Catholic University of Chile and a PhD in Atmospheric Sciences from Cornell University. And also with us, José Miguel Valdés. José Miguel is the Executive Director of Green Lab Deblock, a consulting team linked to Engineering School of Pontificia Catholic University of Chile, specialized in environmental public policy matters, linking the academy to both the public and private sector. His areas of research are the modeling of alternatives for the mitigation of greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants, and the cost-benefit analysis of these alternatives. Francisco and José Miguel were part of the leading team that modeled the result that we are going to present during this session. So, José Miguel, Francisco, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you for the kind introduction. We're going to do this by parts, and I'm going to present just the overview and the general framework that we follow for this exercise, and setting that scene, I will leave it up to José Miguel to take over and present the results of the project. So with that in mind, let us begin. Like Suzi kindly presented, the objectives for this project were to develop a greenhouse gas emission model, incorporating all the sectors that are available within our accounting systems. It's called the National Inventory System, or Inventario de Gases de Efecto Invernadero in Spanish. But it's the way we take into consideration the level of emission, how do they evolve over time in different sectors. And after that, once this model is developed, the idea is to model the effect of greenhouse gas mitigation actions. It's not only ability to reproduce current performance of emissions in Chile, but also to give us an idea of what would be the impact of the introduction of several measures in terms of mitigation, and how much greenhouse gases are reduced. And finally is to generate data for the discussion within the context of the Climate Teens initiative. So the model, we elaborated this model based on several pieces of information or partial models that we have been working with over the last decades, or years, sorry. The conceptual framework is as follows. The exercise is made based on a combination of scenarios and possible baselines. And I'm going to put baselines in quotation marks, but you can understand this as a likely trajectory of the model's exogenous parameters that collectively they represent some plausible conditions that will influence model results in the future. So all the drivers and how do they evolve over time, these are what is called the baselines. And I'm going to give examples of that in a few seconds. And then the other component of the conceptual framework is that we are creating different scenarios, and we call it climate action scenarios. They are also called mitigation scenarios. And it's a combination of different actions and ambition levels that will incorporate into the model in a very collective way. So to present these baselines that we are analyzing here, you see this matrix in which we have a red future, a reference scenario, a green future, and the variable sets that are composed are on one side the global GDP growth, the commodity prices, and the national production level. So it's like the level of economic activity to a certain extent. And then you have a high, medium, and low for all of these variable sets that are considered within this component. In terms of the climate is very important for the next years, and it will condition the performance of the different sectors and the level of emissions. And to mimic what is possible in the future, we have divided and studied the climatology of the most recent 30 years, and we have identified this dry period because we have experiencing a drought over the last decade. This is a very iconic and very interesting piece of information how climate could evolve in the future. Then we selected the decade between 1990 and 1999 as a near normal one, and we used to have a very wet decade, mostly associated with El Niño conditions back in the 80s, and this was selected to represent what is called the climate within the green future. And in the same way, we have also incorporated the differences in the green technology prices. So for a red future, green technology prices are considered as high, probably not so competitive, whereas in the green future, these are much more readily available and likely to be incorporated. The climate action scenarios is based on three levels. One is current policies. That means the implementation of mitigation actions that are selected under current regulation and the available incentives. These are in total 12 actions. For example, the latest announcements of shutdown of coal thermoelectric plants are incorporated within the current policies is a very conservative, perhaps, scenario. The intermediate mitigation plans, these are the implementation of the action developed to achieve carbon neutrality for year 2050. These are embedded within the national determined contribution and also within the what is called the long-term climate strategy that is being led by the Ministry of Environment, and total 41 actions. And we have here a third climate action scenario, which is called accelerated mitigation, and is higher ambition, and the aim is to exceed the NDC commitments, either by achieving much more or earlier incorporation of the measures, and totals 60 actions. Like I said, within the group that we have been developing this exercise, we have worked previously on different sectors, not in a very integrated way, but we had the seeds of what is being included in the model. For the energy component, it has two branches. One is the electricity generation. It's an in-house development application of the model called LEAP. And the energy demands of the LEAP models is based on an projection of energy in the long term that is made by the Ministry of Energy, and has as starting point the model as it is in 2020. Also, other models that are used and incorporated into the Analytica framework are one for the industrial processes and utilities, IPPU sector, that is being developed by Deblock. José Miguel was very involved in that. There is a model for agriculture that we have been working with over the last months for another projects, and it's been developed by one of my students within the Center for Global Change. Also, forestry and land use is incorporated as another sector. So those are the models that we have developed within the Center for Global Change. And there is also a model that accounts for emissions into the residues sector. So these four are integrated and can be combined and displayed within this Analytica software. So to give us just a crude picture on the combination, like I said, it's a matrix approach with climate action scenarios, and also baselines. Baselines influence directly what we call the primary models, or indirectly the secondary models, and these models are fed also not only with the climate action scenarios and baselines, but also with the results of the primary models, for instance, in the forestry and land use sector. And these are incorporated in a tableau of results that is mostly built within this Analytica framework. The models were fit and validated. Just to give you an idea, for the electric sector, we run the models and try to mimic the actual electricity generation and that is being collected until 2020, the data from the Ministry of Energy. The energy demand is fit against what is called the national energy balance. It's an estimate of the demands at different levels of the year, different years, sorry. And non-energy sectors like residues, like agriculture, land use, and forestry, our model was fine-tuned and fit using the data from the National Inventory of Greenhouse Gas Emissions. Future projections are based on the latest available information, for instance, June 2021 of gross domestic product and national production level. And as a summary, just to give you an idea, by year 2020, total national emissions account for 115 million tons of carbon dioxide, and the captures are about 61 million tons of carbon dioxide. So with that, I hand it to José Miguel to continue with results. I don't know if he wants to continue moving his own slides, or I can do it if you want, José Miguel.
Maybe I can do it, so I can use my...
Okay, I will stop sharing that.
Thanks.
José Miguel, we have 10 minutes.
Okay, I try to... Thanks. Okay, so I'm here to show you some of the results we are getting now. As we said before, this is the phase 1. These are the final results for phase 1 of this project. We hope we have a phase 2 and a phase 3 where we can enhance the modeling and we can get deeper into understanding of the results. But this is where we are now.
José Miguel?
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
With us too. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. So I don't know where I get, so I'm going to start this slide again. So here we have the emission projection for the 2020-2030 period of time. This is the period of time we are going to focus, as is the focus of the NDC, of the Chilean NDC. So we're going to compare our results with the commitments we have. So on the left graph, we can see the emissions we are modeling, the results we're getting, and on the right we get the captures we're modeling. So Chile has a big capture. We have around 65 million tons per year of capture because of our forestry and local forest, native forest, and we have around 100 million tons per year of emissions during this period. As Francisco just said, in 2020 it was 115. It goes down because a lot of coal power plants were closed, so the emissions have a big reaction. So here we have in blue, orange, and gray line, we have the three action climate action scenarios. We have the current policy, the intermediate mitigation scenario that kind of follows the NDC, and the gray one is the advanced mitigation scenario. So what we get here is that the intermediate mitigation is actually in kind of in the middle between the current policy and the advanced mitigation. So we have a margin to go further, and we could go, we could get some extra reactions. It's not the same here on the capture graph. We see that the orange and the gray lines are quite close. This means that we didn't find a space for further captures. The NDCs already have a lot of ambitions. So the carbon budget is probably the main commitment of Chile NDC. Chile has committed 1,100 million tons of carbon budget for the period 2020-2030. That means like for an average of 100 million tons per year. That is the commitment. So here in the graph we have the total emission for the period, and the blue line here is the actual commitment. So for the current policy, this is the first one. We see that we failed to meet the goal by quite a margin. How much it will depend in the base and in the future we see. But for the reference future, that's the orange square here. It's around 9%. Yeah, so we failed by around 9%. In the intermediate mitigation, that's close to what the NDC model, our results show that we also failed to meet by around 3%. And in the accelerated mitigation, further mitigation scenario, we fulfilled the commitment and we exceeded by quite a margin. How much it will depend again on the future conditions, but for the reference scenario, it's around 5 to 6%. Not to extend myself, but well, we have a lot of different commitments. We have three main commitments in terms of emission: the carbon budget, the absolute emission for the 2030, and the emission peak. So these are the values, and what we're seeing here, what we're concluding is pretty much the same for each of the commitment. Is pretty much the same we saw for the carbon budget. So the current policy fails to meet the commitment for quite a margin. The interim mitigation is much closer, but still is not there yet. And the advanced mitigation scenario fulfilled in all the cases. It's interesting that the interim mitigation scenario does meet in some cases some of the commitments. It will depend on what are the factors and what are the assumptions we consider, but that is the main conclusion of this. So where are these changes coming from? So here I'm comparing the emissions on 2020, the emissions in 2030 versus 2020. So in 2030, we hope we are projecting that the emission from electricity will be much lower than in 2020 because of the closure of these coal power plants, coal-fired power plants. So even in the current policy, we have quite a reaction because the current policy does consider some of this closure. And interim mitigation goes further, and advanced mitigation scenario goes even further. So we get a lot of reactions. Another important sector is the forestry sector, where we get some reactions, especially in the jump between current policy and interim mitigation. We don't see much space for further mitigation between the advanced mitigation scenario and the interim mitigation scenario. The other sectors, even with ambitious actions, don't mean they do emit more in 2030 than 2020. That's because we are expecting an important growth in this sector. The focus is in 2020, 2030, but we also wanted to see 2050 how it goes with the carbon neutrality commitment. Carbon neutrality in terms of net emission. This is the total emissions minus the captures we get. So again, the current policy fails to meet. The interim mitigation scenario is really close. It depends in which future we get. You could fulfill the commitment. And finally, the advanced mitigation scenario it's pretty much is similar to the medium mitigation scenario, but it goes further and it has more confidence we're going to meet it. In terms of cost, we're going to focus on the 2020-2030 commitment in the budget. So what we're going to get here, the mitigation potential, when we talk about mitigation potential, we were going to talk about how much each of the actions could mitigate in this period. But on the average mitigation cost, we're going to focus on we're going to get the average mitigation cost for the period 2020-2050. This is just because there are some actions that has quite a big important investment, and it's not fair to them to don't count the mitigation they're going to have in the future. So it's just a technique to avoid overestimating the average cost of this action. So just to see the mitigation potential by sector, we find around 170 million tons of CO2 potential, abatement potential. Most of them come from the electricity generation sector, but also the transport sector and the industry sector do afford some mitigation actions. So here we have a mitigation average cost curve for carbon budget. So here in the x-axis we have the mitigation potential for each of the actions we model, and in the y-axis we have the average cost. And here we have each of the actions. The orange ones are, for example, the transport actions. The blue ones are the industry, and the big gray chunk is the electricity generation sector. So what we get here is that we have a lot of mitigation actions are quite cheap. We can fulfill this, and it will mean savings for the country. But to get to fulfill the commitment, we have to get around here. So if we get here, we can see that we're around $80 per ton of CO2. but here it's important to keep in mind that this is the average cost. This is not the marginal cost. This gray big area is a really ambitious action that is closing the coal-fired power plants by 2025. To get you an idea, on 2019, I would say that power-fired plants will generate around 40% of the total electricity in Chile. And nowadays, after some of the close we have some of the coal power plants, I will think that we're around 30–35% maybe. So it's quite ambitious to achieve this goal, and that means a lot of investment, and that means how we get to these $80 per ton. If we could graph the marginal cost, this big chunk will be probably more similar to a triangle. So we will have a lot of potential that's much cheaper than this 80. So that's important to keep in mind, and it's difficult because this result of an optimization model. So it's not as we could. It's difficult to model, and it takes time. So we only present here the average cost. Just to keep in mind, we make a sensitivity analysis of this curve. The total emission abatement potential keeps pretty much the same, but the cost changes quite a lot, especially this gray one, that's the close of the power plant, coal power plant. That in the green baseline is around $50 per ton. In the red baseline is around 150. So we have also a lot of uncertainty in this cost. So yeah, we have to continue working here, and we have to continue to understand which are the main factors that impact these costs, and to conclude what we can do. Just a final thought to keep in mind. The close of these coal power plants is getting a lot of support, or social support and political support. So maybe we won't get achieved. It won't get achieved by 2025. But maybe it will be 2030, maybe 2035. There's a space here, and we will get some of these reactions anyway. So this will be part of the new baseline in the future, of the current policy in the future, if you want. So this will alter the way we will see this curve, and probably we will get a lot of cheaper actions available, and that's important to the goals of the climate teams. I think that's all. Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to discuss anything you want, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Francisco and José Miguel. A couple of questions for you. I think the key question, I would like to start with you, Francisco. What are the main conclusions of this modeling exercise, and in your opinion, what are the main strengths and the limitation of this model? And then, José Miguel, I would like to ask you, what could be the next steps to move toward a more refined or more sophisticated model?
Right. Well, this, besides what is being presented by José Miguel in terms of results, I think there's an overall result here, which is the possibility of having everything connected for once in one model. Results are massively dominated by the electricity sector, and perhaps at second tier from the forestry and land use. But having this possibility of representing a more holistic way, and getting the tools fine-tuned, and that they behave properly when representing the current stage of the emissions give us some trust. So it is the most important result to have this exercise put together, and further measures can be implemented. More ambition can be also developed. As we see enhancements in improvements in technologies. These are also ways to be incorporated in the model, but the general structure here and the connectivity of the sectors is what is one of the most important lessons and also strength of this exercise.
I think you asked me about further steps of the modeling.
Yes.
Yeah, I quite agree with Francisco. We have a structure of models that allow us to dream different paths here. As a modeler, I'm happy to get deeper into the models and new actions and new uncertainties and all. But I think this is a tool. What we hear here is not the future. It's not a projection. It's just an exploration. So I think this tool is important to make it useful for the stakeholders. So the next step probably will see how we can improve the confidence of stakeholders in these models, or what do they need, and then we can work on that. I think that the question is not for me as a moderator. Probably it will be the question for the people who take decisions, and then we have this tool now, and maybe we should work on a toolkit, a complete toolkit to give confidence and transparency for the stakeholders.
Okay, thanks to both Francisco and Jose Miguel. We must move on our agenda. So I would like to introduce our very interesting panel. So now the idea is try to react and discuss about climate action teams and the results presented by Francisco and Jose Miguel. So besides Suzi, we have in our panel Mrs. Sarah Deblock. Sarah manages the ETS market team at the Ministry for the Environment in New Zealand. She has worked on carbon market for over a decade. Prior to moving to New Zealand, she worked for the International Emission Trading Association in Brussels on the EU ETS and advised a member of the European Parliament on environmental and climate policy. Also with us, Mr. Paolo Palotti. Since October 2018, Paolo Palotti was appointed as General Manager of Enel Chile. Previously, he held several high-level positions in Enel Group, such as CFO of Enel Americas, CFO of Enel Italy, and Head of Strategic Planning, among others. Mr. Palotti has also been board member and chairman in several companies located in different countries, such as Italy, Bulgaria, Spain, Czech Republic, among others. From 2009 to 2013, he was professor of business strategy, economics, and management at Louis University, and also professor of the Energy Management Master's program at the Louis Business School. Finally, I think it is also important or relevant to mention that Enel Chile is member of the Corporate Leaders Group for Climate Change, CLG Chile. And we have also another important person from New Zealand, Mr. Paul Young. Paul is a senior analyst at Aotearoa New Zealand's Climate Change Commission, an independent advisory body established in December 2018. Paul joined the Commission upon its establishment to work on its first package of advice on New Zealand's emission budget to 2035. Paul's work at the Commission has focused on sector mitigation pathways and economy-wide scenarios analysis. Paul holds a Master of Science in Physics from the University of Otago and has more than a decade's experience working on climate mitigation issues. And from Chile, also with us today, Mr. Juan Pedro Serl. Juan Pedro has a scientific background on biochemistry. He has nearly 20 years of experience on climate change related matters in Chile, most of them dedicated to multilateral negotiations under UNFCCC. As a landmark of this process, he has participated in the design of the Kyoto Protocol, the Marrakech Accord, in particular with regard to the CDM, and in the debate that culminated in subsequent landmarks under the UNFCCC, such as the Paris Agreement. He works now in the Ministry of the Energy as a head of the climate change in Chile. In his role, he has continued to follow up climate change and negotiations, concentrating efforts on market mechanisms, including Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. In the domestic context, he has been involved in carbon pricing design and implementation in Chile, mainly through the Partnership for Market Readiness initiative with the World Bank, for which he is the national focal point. He is also part of the COP presidency team. So I would like to ask a couple of questions to all of you in order to try to warm up our discussion. So I would like to start with you, Sarah. We can see from the results, and in this case, we have from Chile some flavors and order of magnitude about where the creating baseline could be set under a potential climate action team's agreement. So, assuming that New Zealand will be interested in this type of deal, are there any price ranges to buy mitigation result that New Zealand has discussed internally? And also, how ambitious should be the host country NDC to be attractive for New Zealand? And I would like to also ask you the following. From a perspective of a potential partner country and considering local New Zealand stakeholders, what will be the main concerns that you see? And what will be the potential restriction? Let's talk about, for example, environmental or social safeguards.
Thank you very much for these questions and for the couple of presentations beforehand. I just want to add a personal note before I address your questions. I have only just come back to work after parental leave. This is day 3 for me, so I've tried to get up to speed as much as possible. But one of my technical experts is also on the line and will be helping me if I need an update. I think the call has matched. The timings have worked. We've just avoided the background noise with the baby and the toddler, which was there just before, but they have just left. So I think all is good. It was a really fascinating, I think, presentation. I will get back to you on the price question. I don't have much to add to this, but I think your second question is particularly relevant on, what may be of interest for a purchaser country or for local stakeholders. Obviously, we haven't had those discussions yet with stakeholders, but hearing those presentations this morning has triggered additional thoughts in my mind of what people may be interested in. I think the bottom line from a New Zealand government perspective, I anticipate would be to ensure that this partnership leads to real emission reductions that are additional and properly verified and accounted for, because the whole purpose of what we're discussing in international cooperation is to actually achieve more reductions, right, than what we can achieve at home. What is particularly interesting with climate teams is this effort to drive transformational change in a host country and sector-wide efforts rather than sort of ad hoc projects. So I thought that was really interesting. Regarding stakeholders' views, as I said, that is something we'd need to go out and consult on and test the idea. The focus so far in New Zealand, in the last year or so, probably even longer, has really been on the domestic action and domestic efforts to transition the economy to low carbon emissions. But the narrative is changing. I don't think it's not just slightly changing, it's actually changing, I think, at the moment on efforts to actually align with the Paris Agreement, and therefore looking at, in addition to what is achievable domestically, what additional emission reductions are needed for us to go further. So things that I think stakeholders will be interested in is, of course, the price, the cost of those emission reductions and how that will translate back home. Will there be cost pass through and so on? So how do we address that? Would there be interest in limiting the quantity of such units in advance and making that clear. That may be an option. But I'm also wondering if stakeholders would also be interested in actually where the mitigation comes from and which sectors. I heard in the previous presentation the benefits of how under your accelerated mitigation scenario, this could lead to coal-fired power plants closures and so on. There may be discussions back home in New Zealand if we were to work alongside you on the optics and the politics of this, right? And making the case for New Zealand being involved in as many domestic emission reductions as possible, and the effort that we're doing here with other countries is really to go beyond that, and to focus also on the cost of our transition and ensuring a just transition for stakeholders. So I think that's where the balance lies, but I can anticipate discussions will be needed back home on some of the optics and the politics around this. I may not be the best person to address the question of prices. I think the short answer is I haven't got any sort of specific price range to share with you, but it may be a question, sorry to put people on the spot, but it may be a better question to pose to Paul and the Commission's advice on what a price corridor could look like domestically in the NZETS. So that would be my answer, is that I guess we would want some sort of alignment's probably the wrong word, but we would probably be looking at the domestic cost of abatement and see how aligned or far off we are with the international, with emission reductions that are done overseas.
Thanks, Sarah. So later we can talk a little bit more with Paul about that.
Great.
So from a perspective of the private sector, I would like to ask you, Paolo, what are the main challenges that Chile faces to fully decarbonize the electricity sector? Thinking that they could be technical, economic, or political, and which ones will be should be prioritized in your opinion? Another question is, in your opinion, is early coal phase out feasible in Chile? What will be required in your opinion?
Thank you, Francisco, for your question. Good evening or good morning to everybody, people that are connected to this very interesting panel. Let me first thank CLG to invite me to represent the association to this event. And I will address your questions starting from an important point. Chile has a very large potential in terms of natural resources in order to have a very deep, full decarbonization of the electricity sector. And we're talking about potentials. There is, let's say, a large amount of investment focused on the renewable sectors that are, let's say, installing new capacity that are entering into the systems. In Chile, we have a very large potential in the north, in the solar irradiation, in the south, with wind strength. But we have also some hurdles, as you mentioned. And if we look just at the generation sector, one of the important elements to take into account is the infrastructure. So the possibility to, let's say, create a large amount of installed capacity that can be used, can be fully used in the areas of large demand. So infrastructure is critical, especially today where we are entering with a lot of megawatts in the north with the solar panels, and the large amount of demand is in the center. So the interconnection between the north and the center, and between the south and the center, will be crucial. And interconnection, this kind of connection is something that cannot be built from one day to other. And so this will require time. This is the first big constraint that I see. And where we are, let's say, to work together as companies that we are focused on this, and together with authorities, because this is one of the most important aspects. The other element is how the systems, the electricity system and market can work once we have a lot of renewables is already installed. So there is a matter of stability, affordability, because we know that the volatility of certain natural resources, and so we need certain rules, certain regulation that allow to identify which are the technical elements to be inserted into the system in order to cover these steps. There is an important step ahead during this during these weeks, where we are dealing with the introduction of the storage in the system, a regulation that will allow to remunerate this kind of investment. This is very important, because if we combine a renewable asset together with the storage, for sure we can afford the issue of ancillary services for the system, flexibility, and this is something that could be very, let's say, very important in order to advance along this decarbonization. So there is a matter of infrastructure, regulation, and technical element to be addressed in order to allow to, let's say, phase out conventional thermal facility in order to be substituted with renewable assets. Clearly, very important is the use of hydro facility with basin. That is an additional element for modulating the system. And we have to take into account with all this framework that, as mentioned by Francisco in his presentation, we are facing during the recent years a very tough drought years. So the availability of water resources will not be the same level as we experienced many years ago. Then there is let's say, the decarbonization of the energy sector does not limit the use of renewables in the generation. We have to reach the final clients. We have to reach the final clients with clean energy, and allow the clients to use clean energy on a daily basis, for the use of every day. So we have to, let's say, push on this. And I listened to this framework with very attention, because there is a possibility of using this kind of framework in order to, let's say, try to decarbonize as well the final stage of the use of the energy. So the electric mobility, and we know very well how is Santiago today, the pollution that we are facing, and the contribution that the mobility, the standard mobility is creating is contributing to this pollution. And the use of electricity in all the house, to have an intelligent building with a full use of electricity, from air conditioning, heating, cooking, and these are already available. From a technical standpoint, we are able to manage this use of the energy. The point here is to allow that kind of switch. And Chile, let's say, I have to underpin that as let's say, implemented already certain pilot project where we can switch especially in certain area where there is a deep use of wood, for instance, for eating, for cooking, to switch from the use of wood, very polluting, very contaminating, into air conditioning or into electric cooking. And this is something that would help a lot the decarbonization of the whole environment. And cities are one of the most interesting areas where to work with in order to improve this kind of technology and to reach that kind of target. To answer your second question, how we can manage and the phasing out of the most polluting technology in terms of generation, I have to say that we as Enel, we have already implemented this strategy. We have announced the phasing out of our coal facility. We have already closed 2 of our 3 units, and we will phase out the 3rd one by May 2022. On the other hand, we are investing a lot in renewables. We have a plan of 2.4 gigawatt of new capacity, which 1.3 is under construction, in order to reality to switch into a more polluting technology into a clean one. And one of the drivers out of the technology to be implemented, there is also an economic driver. Today, in Chile, the renewables technology generation is more competitive than the conventional one, the thermal conventional one, by far. And this is the first element. The second element, very important, is that clients are requiring green energy. If you are going to negotiate a large contract with an important client, with an industrial client, or with a mine sector, they will ask for clean energy, and you have to provide large amount for a long term of clean energy. So this is another driver that will push, on top of all the let's say the action that we can do, will push the phase out of the most polluting conventional generation. Clearly, in a framework where the system has to work. So I'm come back to my first point: infrastructure, clear rules. The important point is to have clean and transparent rules to allow the private sector to invest. The very risk that we run today in Chile is that in some cases we have experienced change of the rules along the time, and this is very dangerous for the sector. Clear rules allow long-term investment, and clearly the energy sector is a capital-intensive sector.
Thanks, Paolo, for your complete answers. Following with Chile, I would like to ask to Juan Pedro, now from the perspective of the public sector, and considering what Paolo has mentioned, related with infrastructure, the development of infrastructure, clear regulations and transparent rules, and all the potentialities that we have in our countries. Juan Pedro, from your point of view, from the public sector, what are the main bottlenecks that we should overcome to accelerate decarbonization? What are the priority mitigation actions to boost as soon as decarbonization, trying to link with Paul has recently mentioned? And also a second question: what are the projections of the Ministry of Energy regarding the entry of more renewable energies?
Muchas gracias, Francisco. So thank you for the opportunity to be here at this interesting session, and the 2 presentations were really good. So I will expect some copies of them to look at them more closely. So to refer to your first question on the bottlenecks, I would rather speak about challenges to turn it into a more positive way of thinking. So as you all know, since 2019, within the Ministry of Energy, we have been working hard on carbon neutrality scenarios. And the decarbonization of the energy sector relies strongly on 4 great actions. And I coincide with my previous with a previous colleague from Enel. So the first one is coal phase out, which will decarbonize the power system and all the electricity uses, hence enabling, for instance, e-mobility and green hydrogen as a strong mitigation actions, and lastly, energy efficiency. That we don't have, I mean, let's not forget about energy efficiency in end-use sectors, such as industry, mining, housing, and others. And these measures do not come without challenges. Extreme droughts was also mentioned by the other colleagues in the country, as well as delays in the construction of transmission lines could affect the coal phase-out plan, for instance, and a more, I would say, massive entry of renewable energy, the deployment of green hydrogen industry in time, and the cost of electric vehicles, with which nowadays are, I would say, unreachable for most Chileans, and these are only a few. And also, a previous colleague mentioned to have a storage. Storage is so key to try to cope with the variability of renewable energy. So those to name a few, Francisco. Coming to your first question in terms of the projections, well, since 2019, you all know, and it has been mentioned here today, Chile has a public-private agreement regarding the phase-out of all coal power plants from its power system before 2040. And as you all know, in the last 2 years, several coal plants have forwarded their withdrawal dates. So probably the power system will be coal-free much earlier than 2040. And this is relevant because all this capacity will be replaced by clean energy, renewable energy. And in 2019, our projection were 70% of renewable energy generation by 2030, but now we think that we're expecting maybe around 80% by then. So our latest projections indicate that power system capacity could triple by 2050, with renewable rising to over 90% by mid-century. So these are more or less some encouraging figures of how fast the energy sector is being is transitioning to net zero, I would say. But needless to say here, I think it's so relevant, and it was mentioned by Francisco Meza in his presentation, and the results of the study, is that we will need the carbon capture and storage, not only from nature-based solution, but I would say when it's available and of course affordable, that captured by different technologies. So I will leave it there, Francisco, if there's no more.
Yeah, many thanks, Juan Pedro. Very complete answers. So going back to New Zealand, I would like to ask you a couple of questions as well, Paul. So under your experience in Climate Change Commission, given the uncertainty in exogenous elements that projection or exploration, as José Miguel mentioned it, in this kind of exercise, such as the climate, economy, and demography, how can modeling address this uncertainty to contribute to the confidence of decision makers? And also, the modeling includes a baseline considering some of the exogenous elements, but there is also another source of uncertainty during the implementation of the measures. That responds, for example, to political support, permits, or the development of a proper institutional infrastructure. How can these uncertainties be included in the models to support decision-making process?
Thanks, Francisco. Good morning, everyone. Kia ora koutou. And let me just start by really commending the work that's been done here. I enjoyed reading through the draft papers that were shared, and I know how much work goes into building and then operating the models in an exercise like this. So I imagine you've all been working very hard and will deserve a break. And I think it's a great opportunity for some mutual learning here, given that we at the Climate Commission in New Zealand have just been through a broadly similar set of analysis recently with our budgets advice. So yeah, I think there are some interesting similarities and differences. So to come to your first question, Francisco, I mean, they're both very good questions. I think the uncertainty is an inherent part of any exercise like this, and it's important to deal with it well. I think for a first attempt, it looks like it's been dealt with, pretty well in what you've done. I think modeling can be a good tool for trying to quantify some of that uncertainty. So in my view, it's really about, making the best endeavors to capture the key uncertainties and test the impacts of those with some, robustly informed ranges or parameterization. Now, of course, there are uncertainties that can never really be captured. I think if we'd done a modeling exercise a few years ago, we wouldn't have anticipated the rise of COVID and the impact that that's had, as an example. But making the best endeavors to think it through. I thought it was a nice way to go about it, of packaging some of the key uncertainties into different futures. It's a slightly different to the approach that we used at the Commission, where we only had really one single baseline, but then we did sensitivity testing to individual parameters, such as GDP and population growth. So similar but different approaches. I can see some advantages with the way that it's been done, but in your work. And I think there's also something to be said for trying to, look at individual sensitivity tests to identify maybe what are the really big things that make a really big difference. And, I did one that got my mind really thinking about if you did identify some particularly important exogenous drivers, whether, in a prospective climate teams deal, the outturn of those variables could in fact be part of the agreement in some way. Something worth thinking about, perhaps. And in general, I think just transparency around the assumptions that have been used is critical. It's important to have that out to be able to be scrutinized, and also helpful to give, put things in historical context for I guess people who aren't really familiar with the Chilean context, to understand what has been happening with some of these drivers, so that we can see if the future pathways look plausible. And I guess just quickly on the second question, so as well as all these exogenous uncertainty, I think when you look at any given mitigation measure, there's uncertainty about its mitigation impact, the timing of that, how fast can we deploy it, and in a lot of cases how where it relies on some behavior change, like say building cycleways, to know what effect that will have on people's travel. And it's always uncertain. So that's another key uncertainty to try and capture. And I thought it was an interesting choice to include this the way that you did. There's no one right way to do it here. We did it again a bit differently, where we tried to capture that within the mitigation scenarios. So we had a number of different mitigation scenarios, the sort of bookended by two called headwinds and tailwinds. And within those, they were exploring not only the inclusion of some additional measures like what you've done, but also sort of a range between, low effectiveness and high effectiveness of some of the measures where we're uncertain about what's achievable. So that's another way of approaching it, and there are probably other ways too, but they, without overcomplicating the analysis. So I think, I'll wrap it up there. I guess Sarah kindly kicked a question to me before, so I'll around the prices. Maybe I'll just comment briefly on that. I think from the exercise we did, we didn't do a full marginal abatement cost curve kind of analysis at the end of it. Some of the key conclusions that we did find were that in relation to New Zealand's NDC, sort of maximum ambition domestic pathway didn't meet it. So there was a shortfall there, even with having pretty much all available measures that we could see in New Zealand being rolled out as fast as really practical. And the kind of marginal cost ranges that we were seeing are probably upwards of $100 US a ton out to 2030. So it does appear that there for New Zealand to actually achieve its NDC, there could be some lower cost opportunities offshore, partly just due to practical constraints as well, that although there are some low cost opportunities in New Zealand, given the short time frame we have to act for 2030, there's only so fast that those can be deployed. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. We are receiving also some questions in the chat box. I also see that José Miguel is answering some of the questions to Ede. And we have some question from Victoria. Suzi, the question is for you. So Suzi, could you say more about how climate action teams can create a more appealing environment for international investors? Is there potential for Chile to offer corresponding adjustment to other buyers?
So this is an open area question. What we're interested in doing is finding out ways that international investors who are keen and committed to working in this space and accelerating mitigation can work alongside government, so that rather than working independently, they're actually complementing each other and building stronger agreements overall. So one potential path is that if Chile had an agreement like this, it would enable them to offer financial rewards to very large investors who facilitate that electricity, the acceleration of the electricity transition. So they could de-risk some of that finance, which could make that easier to get the finance in there. They could also, though, put extra effort into resolving some of those regulatory changes that are required to operate a grid that has much higher levels of renewables, or potentially try to accelerate the processes, or just by working more intensively some of the processes to enable transmission to be built, because those are always difficult permitting processes. And then more generally, we might hope that if Chile is increasing the strength of its signaling that it is really committed to a transformational change, that will give confidence to an investor that if they go in, they're going to be supported by the Chilean government. They won't face bureaucratic hurdles that are unnecessary. The government will help them make sure that the rules, etc., are there in ways that could help. And they could potentially be offering subsidies. They could increase the carbon tax, which would make clean investments more attractive in comparison. There are a number of different policies that the government could implement, knowing that if they're successful, there will be additional funding coming to the government from that. And one of the other things that we're really sort of working on and thinking about is, as part of that agreement, is some of the funding that would come from New Zealand and Switzerland or other partners, is some of that funding upfront as well. So some of that funding can come in early, in order that the partners share some of the risk, because you never really know when you do a policy exactly what impact it's going to have on your total emissions.
Perfect. Thanks, Suzi. Suzi, I would also offer you the floor to react to our panelists from New Zealand and from Chile. Any thoughts related with the answers?
I may jump in on the question that's been answered by Suzi in writing on where, whether we are progressing towards a formal agreement between Chile and New Zealand. I think Suzi's covered has covered it perfectly, but I just wanted to add a bit more content on maybe what the focus is on at the moment in New Zealand, which has really been on, well, the Commission's advice on the emission reduction plan and the emission budgets to help us transition to a low carbon economy. But there has really been a focus on this domestic transition. But in parallel, there are these discussions about our NDC and our international contribution. You may have seen that New Zealand's Prime Minister has indicated that New Zealand would be updating its NDC this year. The level is still being worked out. Discussions are still ongoing at the moment. But I think following COP, or possibly following a decision by the government on what the domestic emission budgets may look like, and following COP in terms of what the Article 6 rules may look like, we will get clarity on where the gap is, if you like, what can be achieved domestically, what's our emission budget, what are the rules agreed internationally for cooperation between countries? Can that be a source of a cooperation for New Zealand to engage in, or do we want to go a different route? And do we want to develop our own rules and partnerships with specific countries? So there's still a lot of unknowns that are being worked out. So hopefully we'll get clarity at COP this year. And by May of next year is when the government will be publishing its emission reduction plan in reaction to the Commission's advice.
Francisco? Oh, Suzi? Or
no, you go.
No? No, I mean, we're more or less in the same situation as in New Zealand. I mean, we're trying to focus our efforts in domestic actions. So, but I guess looking at this study that Universidad Católica has presented today, and also as how Suzi has described this initiative, I think it makes sense. We've been thinking about this very much. So what we are doing now is trying to factor in carbon pricing in a more, I would say, general term into our own, not just the NDC, because as you said it, I think it was Paul from New Zealand. Yeah, I mean, the NDC is around the corner. I mean, we have not that much time to get it on track, but we're also looking into 2050. So it's not that we're not thinking about Article 6, we're thinking about Article 6 a lot, and carbon pricing in general. So what I think it's interesting from the proposal from this initiative is that you're trying to be very clear in terms of this is considered additional to the NDC effort, right? So and you see also that we can even go further with this with the third scenario that was shown today, that we can still be achieving the NDC and also be in a position to trade some volumes of credits. My only question would be, given that this NDC and the next one supposed to be like stepping stones, you know, to reach our goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. So my question would be how to look at 2030 without losing the perspective of the long-term vision of being, you know, net zero in 2050, and I think that should be responded by the following. If we look at the carbon pricing as only helping us in I don't know, in mitigation, in mitigating emissions that now we consider are the high-hanging fruits, that's okay. But also, Suzi, you have mentioned, and the study has been very clear in that, in the following, that if we can use carbon pricing, we can use Article 6 to accelerate current, you know, trends in our NDC. That's a good point, because that will mean that we cannot just focus on activities that are outside the NDC right now, we can also focus on activities that are inside the NDC, but we can, accelerate their implementation. So we, expand the horizon for more mitigation. So yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, this initiative is interesting in that sense. But as I said, we still need to understand better the role that Article 6 will play in our domestic efforts, because we by no means want to jeopardize our commitments. We have an NDC. It's far more ambitious than the previous one, and we need to keep that trend. To curb the mitigation, or not, how to say, to curvar la curva, I don't know, to curve whatever
Bend the curve.
Yeah,
bend the curve, right?
Yes, yeah. So we need to have clarity on that, and we don't have any agreement signed yet with New Zealand or with, I don't know, Switzerland or whatsoever, but we're thinking on that. And if you look at the new NDC, there's a mentioning of the role of Article 6 in maybe increasing our mitigation efforts, and we're looking into developing like a national policy to use Article 6. So those are good signs in the sense that we're thinking seriously about carbon pricing. You all know that we have a tax which is, I would say, it's a low rate in terms of the, I don't know, the size, if you wish, sorry, I'm confusing myself. It's a low tax rate, and we know that we should be around 40 to 50 US dollar per ton. I don't know, in 2030 maybe. But I guess these are tiny steps to really put the right price on carbon and to make that transition more faster than planned. And as you have said here, we think that the coal phase out is so crucial because according to our estimations, I'm extending a little bit, sorry, but according to our estimations, the coal phase out by 2050 will imply like 13% of total GHG reductions in our inventory in that year. But it triggers the whole, whole bunch of measures in I don't know, in energy consumption, in industry, in everywhere. So it's our, I would say, not a silver bullet, but it's a major measure.
Francisco, I don't know if you may jump in just for a quick tip, looking
yes,
at
of course,
a different perspective. I have heard with interest about this scheme and this possibility of having this connection between partners in order to, let's say, have the link for decarbonization, for avoiding CO2 emission. What I'm thinking is that until now, we had some, looking at short term, we had some interesting projects in order to limit or avoid the emission coming from polluting use of the energy. But all these schemes, even if we had performed it with the support of the Ministry of Environment on one side, one project, and Ministry of Energy on one side, another project, has been based on private sector effort. On one side, we had certain companies that can use this abatement of emission for their environmental balance, and they finance the switching from using of wood into air conditioning or heating system, electric air conditioning, electric heating system. On the other side, we have been required to provide reduced tariff in order to support the consumption of the electricity for electric heating and for cooking. And this is, let's say, limited apport, and it will take time. If it could be possible to implement a scheme where there would be this kind of contribution, the application could be very, very large, and the impact would be higher. On the other way around, if we look at long term, the opportunity of green hydrogen for Chile is huge. But there is a matter of technology in order to have electrolyzer that can produce green hydrogen at competitive level in terms of cost of production. And the other side is to create internal demand. So acting on the industrial process or certain category of industry, on the use of certain trucks, heavy trucks or heavy machinery in the mining sector, in order to switch from the current polluting use of energy into green hydrogen. So the point here is to how we can think about a scheme using what we discussed today in order to push on this switching into industrial process and start to adopting grid. And this is a long-term view, because for electrification, we are here. Tomorrow we are continuing to improve the use of electrification in the country, electric mobility, private mobility, use of the electrification also in certain industrial sector. But if we look at the long term, we cannot reach everywhere with electricity. And so maybe that this scheme can help to support a full decarbonization of the use of the energy.
Thanks, Paolo. I think before to end, I would like to give you the floor, Suzi, to react to this comment.
Can I just suggest that some people may need to leave on time, and you should feel totally comfortable doing that. But this is such a great conversation that if you are able to stay, that would be wonderful too. So I just wanted to respond, I guess, to a couple of those comments, both really great. So to one, Pedro, and if a climate team works as we intend it to, and sort of almost regardless, it will help Chile to achieve its NDC, because it really protects the achievement of the NDC. New Zealand shouldn't want to buy credits from Chile unless it thinks Chile is going to be in compliance. So you would now have another partner who is on your side, trying to make sure that you really do achieve your NDC. And after 2030, because to achieve that NDC, you can't just change things year by year. You actually have to make really big investments. You're triggering that sort of transformational change, movement into hydrogen, closing of coal and replacing it. You're going to find that after 2030, you're in a much better position to continue to have lower emissions and keep having emissions going down. So this should be something that isn't anything to do with low-hanging fruit. This is helping you to get to the high-hanging fruit faster. And that's very much the way it's been designed, because it's not in any of the interests of the rest of us in the world to just to have you not comply. And then I think Paolo was completely getting to it in terms of the next really important steps is, so given this modeling, we've identified the opportunities, we can refine that and do better in that, but how exactly are we going to make that happen? And how could a country like New Zealand working with Chile actually help to get over some of those barriers to be able to do this faster? Is it by providing technology or jointly learning about the technology? Because I know there's interest in hydrogen in New Zealand as well. Maybe that's something there could be some sharing. Is it about working together on policies where New Zealand can learn from some of Chile's policies, but maybe Chile can learn some of the pricing stuff, which New Zealand has a lot of experience with? I can see opportunities where there are challenges in dealing with Indigenous lands and making sure that Indigenous rights are protected. New Zealand has extraordinary experience in that space. In other spaces, it could work the other way, but getting down to those details, what is it that New Zealand would be offering to help with? What would New Zealand be getting out of the deal? What does this look like in a more concrete space? What sort of investments would we be looking for large investors to come in and say, if you're going to do this, we think this is really attractive and we're willing to provide the finance for that major transmission or for that conversion to hydrogen in that industry.
Thank you, Suzi. Paolo.
Yeah, no, let's say elaborating as an early stage in the sense that, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a lot of potentials and there is also some area already identified where to work. So, and we have the experience of, let's say, I'm referring with the system, so I'm not referring as a company, but a private-public combination of action. And you see, according to join the force, we have been able to develop an important advance in the use of the electric mobility in the public sector. And in this, Santiago and Chile is managing the largest fleet of electric buses outside China. So we have some experience on this. Clearly, we have to elaborate how these alliances can work if providing knowledge, provide technology, or Chile can define its own plan for targeting certain reduction on top of the NDC, and then sharing with the partners certain funds in order to implement and to be measured the advance of certain actions that can be defined, share and define together. So this is my early reaction regarding what I have heard. Clearly, there is a lot of work to do, to discuss, to implement some, but I think that this is my first reaction according listening this very interesting discussion.
It has been a great discussion. Thank you to all of you for being in this side event. We have some conversations in the chat box as well, very interesting between Juan Pedro and Juan Paulo. And to end our event, I will read you the floor to our project manager, Ana Puello. So for my side, thank you very much, Sara, Paolo, Juan Pedro, Paul, José Miguel, and Francisco, and also, of course, Suzi. Thank you for your time. I think it was a very productive conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I will just close the session for 5 minutes. So don't leave yet. I've been trying to prepare some takeaway notes from all your discussions. First of all, I want to thank Francisco for doing an excellent job in creating this session and also facilitating it. I think it was great that we could have the perspectives of all the diversity of perspectives from the modelers and researchers showing us what can be done, what is the potential for emission reductions, even in a very stylized way with modeling, it shows us what is possible. And then we had policy makers showing us the political environment in which they act, how they set the rules for this to happen, and what are the tensions that they face between what they have to do domestically and what they can do with international mitigation and all the different actors. And also we had the perspective of the private sector, which was with Paolo telling us what the companies that are actually on the ground making these long-term investments, what they need to reduce their risk. So I took some quick notes from each of the presenters just to give you the final summary for the session. So first from Suzi, what I took away from her presentation is that while there's a clear need for accelerated mitigation and international carbon trade can increase our ambition, giving us the possibility to achieve more with less, more abatement with less money as compared to a situation in which all mitigation would be done domestically by each country. The climate ambition team model that we are proposing builds from the previous experience in international carbon trade with the Kyoto Protocol and tries to solve some of the problems that were found in with that experience. So the CAT approach avoids the hot air problem that we found before because it departs from our already very ambitious baseline that is provided by the NDC. It also is an economy-wide approach which reduces transaction costs. So we don't need all these complex, costly approach like the CDM projects where we needed to demonstrate additionality for each single project and also to involve auditors and monitor every single project and create a counterfactual for each project. It's an economy-wide approach that makes it more higher integrity and also lower transaction cost. Suzi introduced a pilot of this CAT approach in which Chile would be the host partner and New Zealand and potentially also Switzerland and Canada would be the partners. What I took away from the presentation of the modeling team in Chile is that, first of all, the Chilean NDC is already very ambitious. So we could see with the intermediate scenario, it was already quite difficult to achieve. So we are not, it's not a situation where a partner would come and buy easy emission reductions, easy and cheap emission reduction. The low-hanging fruit, the negative emission possibilities are already taken by the NDC. So we're going really to the ambitious scenario with a climate team. A partner would be buying emission reductions that are not cheap and that are not hot air. So that could give credibility to the partners when they have to explain to their stakeholders, to their constituents, why they need international mitigation and why this is not hot air as it was before. From the New Zealand, it was interesting also to see the big emphasis that New Zealand is putting on domestic mitigation and how international mitigation would go beyond this. So it would not be a way to avoid domestic mitigation. It would only be a way to go far beyond this to achieve more when it is too costly or too difficult for New Zealand to reach. Also, it was very interesting from Paolo from Enel to see all the different barriers that Chile faces to achieve all the potential that it has for emission reductions. So he talked about transmission infrastructure as being a barrier, about the need to balance the load in a model with high penetration of variable intermittent renewables, also the electrification of end uses. And it was very interesting as well how he illustrated the transition that his own company has done by closing the coal plants, and it's about to close the last coal plant that they have. And I took also the message of him saying that what the private sector needs for long-term investments is certainty. So the climate action team would be another way to introduce that further certainty for long-term investment by signaling that Chile is committing to this very ambitious mitigation and that it has a group of partners highly committed as well to support them and to reward them. So it's another signal that provides certainty for long-term investments. Juan Pablo from the Ministry of Energy also indicated all the different needs to achieve this ambitious mitigation. And Paul Young from the modeling, from the Climate Change Commission, I was quite excited to hear about the opportunities for mutual learning between New Zealand and Chilean modeling communities and how their modeling exercises can learn from each other. It was also interesting to hear how ambitious the NDC in New Zealand is. So we are looking at a situation in which countries are already doing their best to meet their NDCs and trying to go beyond that through an instrument like climate action team. So with that, I kind of tried to summarize what the discussion, but I just want to tell you where we're going next to the project. We will be sharing this report, the modeling report soon, the final draft, so that you can all see it. We will also be present at the COP in Glasgow. I don't know if virtually or in person, in face-to-face. And we'll be preparing a policy brief ahead of this, a very short document to give more detail about how a climate action team would work. We will be carrying a number of dissemination activities that you will also be invited to, and you can always check our website that will have all the updates on what's going on with the project. And with that, because I think we're a little bit late, I would like to say goodbye and thank you to everyone, and hope to see you soon, and hope that you will keep on being engaged with this initiative in the future.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, thanks.